A blacksmith's daughter has no place among nobles. Lady Hedwiga's voice cut through the castle hall. A noblewoman smiled into her wine. Then the riding gloves struck. The crack echoed against the stone walls. A red mark bloomed across Agnes's cheek. The iron cauldron in her hands was hot enough to burn flesh through cloth. She never dropped it. She never cried. She never begged. The cauldron shifted in her grip, then steadied. Lady Hedwiga glanced at the guard beside the door. "Remove it from the hall." Laughter moved through the room like a wave. First one guest, then three more, then the far table. A man in a fur-trimmed coat lifted his goblet without looking up. A woman near the fireplace turned back to her conversation before Agnes had even moved. Nobody stopped it. Nobody spoke against it. The hall simply continued. Candlelight warm across silk and silver, music soft from the far end, roasted pheasant cooling on long tables, as though nothing of any weight had just occurred. Agnes turned and walked back toward the servants' corridor. The smell of the hall followed her a few steps. Warm beeswax, roasted meat, wine soaking into cold stone. Then it gave way to the smell she knew: iron, smoke, kitchen ash. Above her, the great banners of Castle Krenberg hung motionless, the crest of Lord Brennan embroidered in gold and deep red, watching everything and saying nothing. Nobody followed her. Nobody asked if she was hurt. What nobody inside Castle Krenberg knew that night was that before the last candle burned out, every person in that hall would be forced to kneel before her. But to understand how that happened, you have to go back to the morning, back to the forge, back to the moment a father pressed a small medallion into his daughter's hands and said the only 4 words he could manage, and could not say the rest. The forge was the warmest place in the village before sunrise. While the rest of Krenberg slept beneath frost-heavy roofs, Tomasz was already at the anvil. The bellows breathed. Coals glowed orange and deep red in the dark, throwing long shadows across the low stone walls, across the hanging tools, across the leather apron worn soft from 20 years of the same work. The hammer came steady and unhurried, not loud, just present, the way a heartbeat is present. Agnes came through the village while it was still dark. On the narrow path beside the miller's house, she found old Vera crouched over a water bucket that had slipped from her hands and cracked against the frozen ground. Agnes set down her breakfast cloth, lifted the bucket, walked to the well, filled it, and carried it inside for her. The old woman said nothing. Agnes did not wait to be thanked. She picked up the cloth and continued to the forge. Her father did not stop working when she came through the low door. She did not expect him to. She set everything on the wooden bench: bread, lard, a clay cup of ale still warm from the hearth, and watched him for a moment. His hands were enormous, scarred across every knuckle, darkened with iron dust that no washing ever fully removed. But they moved with surprising gentleness. They always had. With horses, with children, with broken things. He set the hammer down when he was ready, not before. He ate standing, the way he always did. Agnes wrapped her hands around her cup and listened to the river. Above the village, Castle Krenberg sat on its hill, its torches burning for tonight's ball. She had been asked to help in the kitchen. She had said yes without hesitation. She always said yes. Tomasz set down the empty cup. He reached into his apron pocket and took out something small, a medallion on a thin cord, silver, worn smooth, bearing a crest she did not recognize. He held it out without speaking. She took it. "Your mother's," he said. He almost said something else. Almost. She saw it, the way his jaw tightened, the way his eyes moved to the floor for just 1 second, like a man standing at the edge of something deep. Then the hammer rose again. Agnes put the cord around her neck and tucked the medallion beneath her collar, close to her skin. She did not ask questions. She never asked for more than was offered. But walking up the hill toward the castle, she touched it once through the cloth, and felt, without knowing why, that it had been waiting a long time to be worn. The castle kitchen hit her like a wall. Heat first, thick and pressing, the kind that soaks through wool in seconds. Then smell, roasting meat, rendered fat, onions blackening in iron pans, bread pulled from the stone oven still steaming at the center. Somewhere deeper in the room, a pot of something rich and dark was reducing over the fire, filling every corner with the smell of wine and bone. Agnes tied her apron and went to work without being asked. The kitchen moved like a controlled panic. Servants crossed each other's paths carrying platters, ladles, stacked wooden boards. A boy of no more than 10 ran past her with a tray of salt cellars, his eyes wide with the terror of dropping something. The head cook, a large red-faced man named Pavel, moved through it all shouting instructions nobody seemed to hear and everyone somehow followed. Agnes took the heaviest tasks without being told. She knew kitchens. She knew how to read a room that was close to breaking. Young Berta was struggling near the far hearth. She was small, too small really for the cauldron she was carrying. It was full of rendered lard, heavy and shifting with each step, and her arms were shaking by the time Agnes noticed. Berta's daughter, a child of perhaps 3, sat on a folded blanket directly on the floor beside the hearth, playing with a wooden spoon, directly below where the cauldron was going. Agnes moved before she thought. She crossed the kitchen in 4 steps, caught the cauldron with both hands just as Berta's grip gave way. The metal seared through her cloth wrapping. She held it anyway, set it down on the hearthstone, steady, slow. The child looked up, unbothered, and went back to her spoon. Berta pressed both hands over her mouth. Her eyes filled immediately. She didn't even see. "She's fine," Agnes said quietly. Berta nodded, unable to speak. Agnes unwrapped her hands. The skin beneath was red and tight. She wrapped them again with a dry cloth from her apron pocket, tighter this time, and picked up the next task from the bench without comment. From somewhere far above the kitchen ceiling, muffled by stone and distance, came the sound of music. The ball had begun. Agnes stepped out of the kitchen to carry slop to the yard and heard it immediately. A sound she knew. Not the normal shifting of horses in cold stalls, not the stomp of hooves on frozen straw. This was heavier, labored, the breathing of an animal in real distress, long and ragged, with a catch at the end of each exhale that meant pain. She set the bucket down and followed the sound. The stable was at the far end of the yard. Old Martin stood outside the door with his cap in both hands, turning it in circles the way men do when they don't know what else to do with themselves. A young stable hand Agnes didn't recognize leaned against the wall with his arms crossed. "Lady Hedwiga's mare," Martin said when he saw her, "went down an hour ago. Foreleg." Agnes moved toward the door. The young stable hand stepped in front of her. "The steward said nobody touches her. She's Lady Hedwiga's horse. You're a kitchen girl." "I'm a blacksmith's daughter," Agnes said quietly. "Move, please." He didn't move. She looked at him for a moment, not with anger, just with patience, the kind that outlasts almost everything. Then she walked around him and pushed through the stable door. The mare was down on her side in the largest stall, one foreleg bent wrong. Her eye was showing white at the edge, dark and rolling. The straw around her was soaked through. Agnes knelt beside the mare's head and did not reach for her immediately. She waited. Let the horse hear her breathing first. Let her feel that the air had stopped moving so fast. You do not grab a frightened animal. You arrive slowly, like weather. Her father had taught her that before she was old enough to reach the anvil. The mare's breathing began to even just slightly. Agnes placed one hand on the side of her neck, held it there, spoke in a low voice, not words exactly, just sound, steady and without urgency. Martin came behind her and wrapped the leg without being asked. Her burned hands guided each fold of the sacking. Neither of them spoke. When it was done, the mare lay still, eye closed, breathing slow. Martin looked at Agnes across the horse between them. "God put the wrong people in the wrong rooms tonight," he said quietly. Outside, the young stable hand was gone. Lady Hedwiga moved through Castle Krenberg the way water moves through a crack in stone, quietly, precisely, finding every weakness. She had been awake since before the kitchen fires were lit. By the time the first guests arrived, she had walked every corridor of the castle twice, checked every table arrangement in the great hall, replaced 2 flower displays that displeased her, and dismissed a chambermaid for setting candles unevenly along the east window ledge. The girl had cried. Hedwiga had watched her go with the expression of someone correcting arithmetic. The ball had to be perfect. It always had to be perfect. She paused now in the doorway of the great hall, wine-glass in hand, watching the room the way a general watches a battlefield. The candles were right. The silver caught the light correctly. Lord Brennan stood near the fireplace, laughing with 2 merchant lords, broad and comfortable, and completely unaware of the dozen small disasters his wife had prevented before he'd even dressed for the evening. He never noticed. He never needed to. That was the arrangement. A maid crossed the hall carrying a platter, and Hedwiga's eyes tracked her automatically. Posture, speed, the angle of the platter. Acceptable. She moved on. Near the entrance, the housekeeper, Mrs. Novak, appeared at her elbow. "The kitchen girl is still on the grounds," she said quietly. "The blacksmith's daughter. She was seen in the stables." "It touched my mare?" "Apparently it helped with the leg, my lady. Old Martin says—" "I didn't ask what Martin says." She took a slow sip of wine. Across the room, a guest laughed too loudly at something Lord Brennan had said, and Hedwiga's eyes moved there briefly, calculating, filing, moving on. She had come from nothing. A house with 4 rooms and a father who borrowed money from men who did not forget. She had understood from the age of 12 that the world sorted people into 2 groups, those who were looked at and those who were looked through. She had spent every year since then making absolutely certain which group she belonged to. Which is why a blacksmith's daughter standing still under a blow disturbed her in a way she could not quite name. Stillness like that meant something. She just hadn't decided what yet. Agnes carried the cauldron back to the kitchen and set it down on the hearthstone. She stood there for a moment, with her hands still wrapped around the handles. The metal had cooled enough to hold, but the skin beneath her cloth wrapping was tight and hot. Around her, the kitchen continued. Pavel shouting, ladles clanging, a boy dropping something wooden that clattered across the stone floor and made everyone flinch. Nobody looked at her. She unwrapped her hands, rewrapped them, and walked to the far end of the kitchen where the storage room door stood slightly open. She slipped inside and pulled it shut behind her. Dark, cold, the smell of dried herbs, flour dust, and old wood. She stood with her back against the door. For 30 seconds, Agnes did not move. Then her shoulders dropped, just slightly, just enough. The tears came without sound. She had learned that young, in a house where the walls were thin and her father slept lightly, and grief was something you carried quietly so as not to add to anyone else's weight. Her face did not change much, just her eyes, and her breathing, and the way her hands pressed flat against the door behind her, as though steadying herself against something that wanted to pull her down. She thought of the hall, the laughter, the man in the fur-trimmed coat who had not looked up, the woman near the fireplace who had turned away before Agnes had even moved. The way Lady Hedwiga's voice had carried, not loud, not angry, just certain. The way certainty in the wrong hands was the cruelest weapon of all. 30 seconds. She wiped her face with her apron, once across each eye. Then she straightened her back, the way her father straightened after a long day at the anvil, not because the weight was gone, but because standing straight was simply what you did next. She opened the door. The kitchen light hit her face. Pavel was still shouting. The boy had picked up whatever he'd dropped. Berta was stirring something at the far hearth, her daughter now asleep on the folded blanket beside her feet. Agnes picked up the next task from the bench. Nobody saw. Nobody knew. Above the castle, the winter sky had gone fully dark, and somewhere in the yard below, wheels were moving on frozen gravel, heavy, deliberate, bearing a crest nobody at Castle Krenberg had been expecting tonight. The carriage came through the gates without announcement. No outriders, no herald, just the sound of wheels on frozen gravel and 4 black horses moving at a pace that suggested the driver had been told to arrive before a certain hour and had taken that seriously. The royal crest on the carriage door caught the torchlight for just a moment as it swept into the yard. Gold on black, unmistakable to anyone who knew what they were looking at. In the kitchen, Pavel stopped mid-sentence. In the great hall, the music stuttered. Mrs. Novak appeared at Lady Hedwiga's elbow so quickly it seemed she had materialized from the wall itself. "Lord Edmund Voss," she whispered. Hedwiga was already moving. She handed her wineglass to the nearest servant without looking at them, touched the front of her gown once with both hands, and walked toward the entrance hall with the particular speed of a woman who would not be seen rushing. Behind her, Lord Brennan detached himself from his conversation by the fireplace and followed, still laughing at something, not yet understanding that the evening had just changed. Lord Edmund Voss stepped out of the carriage. He was older than Agnes had imagined a royal advisor would look, though she was watching from the kitchen doorway, flower still on her sleeve, and had not imagined much. He was perhaps 60, thin in the way of men who forget to eat when their minds are occupied, with a gray traveling coat that seen considerable road and showed it. He carried no ceremony with him, no particular expression. He looked at Castle Krenberg the way a man looks at a place he has been sent to rather than chosen to visit. Hedwiga descended the entrance steps with her warmest smile. Lord Edmund looked at her the way he had looked at the castle. He nodded once, handed his gloves to a servant, walked inside. Hedwiga's smile held perfectly. Beside her, Lord Brennan filled the silence with words. Welcome, honor, long journey, finest wine. Edmund answered in the way of a man who has heard every version of this particular speech and retains none of it. The servants parted ahead of him without being asked. Agnes watched him cross the yard from the kitchen doorway. There was something in the way he moved, unhurried, self-contained, missing nothing, that reminded her strangely of her father. She went back to work. She did not know yet that within the hour that man would stop in a corridor and look at something around her neck, and the evening would crack open like frozen ground in spring. The corridor between the kitchen and the great hall was narrow and poorly lit. One torch on the left wall, another at the far end, and between them a stretch of cold stone that smelled of tallow and damp wool. Servants used it constantly. It was the fastest route from the kitchen to the hall without crossing the yard, and Agnes had walked it perhaps a dozen times already that evening, carrying platters, pitchers, stacked linen. She was carrying a water pitcher now. She heard his footsteps before she saw him, measured, unhurried, coming from the direction of the east corridor where the guest rooms were. She moved to the right to give way, the way servants did, eyes down, pitcher held level. Lord Edmund rounded the corner and nearly walked into her. He stopped. She stopped. "Forgive me," Agnes said, stepping further right. He didn't move. He was looking at something. She followed his eyes without thinking and realized he was looking at her neck, at the place where the medallion had slipped outside her collar some time during the evening, hanging now on the front of her apron, catching the torchlight. The corridor was very quiet. "Girl," Lord Edmund said.
His voice was not unkind, it was simply precise, the voice of a man who chose words the way her father chose iron, for what they could bear. "Where did you get that?" It was not quite a question. Agnes looked down at the medallion. "My father gave it to me this morning, my lord. He said it was my mother's." Edmund said nothing. He took one step closer and looked at the medallion without touching it. His face showed nothing that Agnes could read, not recognition exactly, not surprise, something more internal than either. The expression of a man who has just heard a sound he cannot immediately place, but knows he has heard before. A long moment passed. "Your father," Edmund said carefully. "He lives in the village?" "Yes, my lord. He is the blacksmith, Tomasz." Edmund looked at the medallion one final time. Then he walked past her without another word, back the way she had come, his footsteps measured and unhurried as before. Agnes stood in the corridor alone. The torch at the far end flickered in a draught from somewhere. She tucked the medallion back beneath her collar and continued toward the hall with the pitcher. But her hand as she walked stayed pressed against her chest, where the medallion was warm, where it had always been warm.
The library of Castle Krenberg was cold, even with the fire going. Lord Edmund sat alone at the long table, with 3 candles pulled close and documents spread across the wood in an order that looked like disorder but wasn't. He had spent 40 years in royal service learning the difference between what he knew and what he thought he knew. Right now, he thought he knew something he could not yet prove. The crest on the medallion belonged to House Radoslav, he was certain of that. Falcon on the left, 3 vertical lines on the right. He had seen it on correspondence, on property seals, on the signet ring of Lord Antonin Radoslav himself at court 30 years ago. Antonin had died without a male heir. His daughter had appeared briefly at court, quiet, dark-haired, and vanished. The official record said she had died shortly after, along with her child. Edmund had written part of that official record himself. He pulled the oldest document in the stack toward him, a letter from 22 years ago sent to the Crown from a border magistrate in this district 40 miles from Castle Krenberg. It concerned an unnamed noblewoman who had appeared in the area on foot, in poor condition, accompanied by no one. The magistrate had noted one detail that nobody at court had considered significant at the time. She had been asking for a blacksmith. Not shelter, not a physician, not a priest, a blacksmith. Edmund set the letter down carefully. He pulled a second document, a court deposition from the same year, taken from an innkeeper near the village of Krenberg, who claimed to have sheltered a woman matching the description for 2 nights. The innkeeper had remembered her because of the medallion she wore, and because of the name she had spoken once, quietly, to herself, thinking no one could hear. Tomasz. Edmund sat back from the table. Outside the library window, the winter night was completely silent. No wind, no movement, just cold and darkness, and the distant sound of music from the great hall where people were eating roasted pheasant and drinking imported wine and laughing at things that would not matter in the morning. He sent Mrs. Novak for Lord Brennan. Brennan arrived still holding his wine, and Edmund watched his face carefully as he read the innkeeper's deposition. The wine glass lowered slowly. Brennan's face did something complicated. "You'd better go to him yourself, tonight." Edmund was already standing. Lord Edmund walked into the great hall at the midpoint of the second course. He did not announce himself. He did not need to. The nearest guests saw him first. A ripple of turned heads, a conversation cut short, a laugh that died before it finished. The musicians, watching the room the way musicians do, felt the change before they understood it, and slowed one by one, bow by bow, until the last instrument trailed into silence somewhere in the middle of a phrase. The hall waited. Edmund stood at the entrance and looked at the room without expression. long tables, candlelight on silver, roasted meat and wine, and the faces of people who had spent the evening certain of their place in the world. He spoke clearly enough for everyone to hear. 22 years ago, he said, the daughter of Lord Antonin Radoslav disappeared from court. The official record stated she had died. That record was incomplete. Nobody moved. House Radoslav is one of the oldest noble houses in Bohemia. Its line did not end. It continued, here, in this district, unknown to the crown and unknown to itself. Lord Brennan stood very still near the fireplace. Lady Hedwiga's hand tightened around her wine-glass. The guests exchanged glances that meant nothing because none of them yet understood what was happening. Edmund turned and walked back out of the hall. The silence he left behind was the particular kind that follows something irreversible. Edmund found Agnes in the kitchen. She was scrubbing a pot, her burned hands moving carefully around the rim, her apron dark with the work of the evening. Berta was nearby, her daughter asleep against her shoulder. The kitchen was quieter now. The worst of the night was over, the food delivered, the panic settled into exhaustion. Edmund stopped in the doorway. "Come with me," he said.
Agnes looked up. She searched his face for some explanation and found none. She set down the pot, dried her hands on her apron, and followed him. She did not change her apron. She did not smooth her hair. She walked into the great hall as she was, flower on her sleeve, hands red from hot water and burned from the cauldron, smelling of iron and kitchen smoke. She stopped in the center of the hall. For a moment nobody moved. Then Berta appeared in the doorway behind her, still holding her sleeping daughter, her bandaged hand pressed against the child's back. She looked at Agnes across the hall and dropped to her knee on the cold stone floor. Old Martin appeared beside her a moment later, cap in hand. He knelt without a word. The kitchen boys behind them knelt together, awkward and uncertain because the people they trusted were kneeling, and that was enough. Then Lord Brennan, then the guests, one by one, the sound of it moving through the room like something slow and inevitable, like water finding its level. Lady Hedwiga was last. She stood the longest. Her wine-glass was still in her hand. Her face showed nothing, or rather it showed everything held very tightly in check, the way a door holds against pressure from the other side. Then her knees bent, and she went down like everyone else, and the wine-glass touched the stone floor beside her, and the hall was completely still. Agnes stood in the center of it. No triumph on her face, no satisfaction, just stillness. The same stillness that had disturbed Lady Hedwiga in the corridor that morning. The same stillness she had carried through the slap and the cauldron and the storage room and the stable and the long, cold hours of the kitchen. She had not changed. That was the thing. Through all of it, she had not changed at all.
The hall remained on its knees for a long moment. Then Agnes spoke. Her voice was quiet, not weak, just quiet, the way her father's hammer was not loud but always present. She looked at Lord Edmund and said the only thing she had decided to ask for since the moment she understood what was happening. "Don't punish her publicly." Edmund looked at her. "Lady Hedwiga, asking whatever comes next, the legal matters, the title, the documents, I don't ask about any of that. I ask for that one thing." The hall heard every word. Lady Hedwiga, still on her knees, still holding her wine-glass against the cold stone floor, did not look up. Something moved across her face that was not quite shame and not quite relief, and was perhaps the beginning of understanding that those two things could arrive together. Edmund studied Agnes for a long moment, the way he had studied the documents in the library.
the way he had studied the medallion in the corridor, looking for something he could trust. He found it. "As you wish," he said. Someone in the hall exhaled, then another. The silence broke slowly, the way ice breaks in early spring, not all at once, but in pieces, each one releasing something that had been held too long. Agnes left Castle Krenberg before the last candle burned out. She did not wait for carriages or ceremony or further conversation. She took her apron off at the kitchen door, folded it over the bench where she had worked all evening, and walked out through the servants' gate into the winter dark. The village was asleep, frost on the rooftops, stars very bright and very cold overhead. Her breath came in small clouds that dissolved immediately into the dark air. The forge was lit. Tomasz was waiting, not pacing, not anxious, just sitting on the low bench outside the forge door the way he sat when he was thinking through a difficult piece of work. The fire behind him threw orange light across the yard. He looked up when he heard her footsteps on the frozen path. He looked at her for a long time. Then he told her everything. He told her about her mother, who she had been, where she had come from, why she had run, why she had made him promise to say nothing until the time was right or until the truth arrived on its own. He told her about the letter beneath the floorboard, the seal he had never broken because breaking it had felt like ending something. He told her about the morning 20 years ago when he had placed a newborn girl against his chest and walked through winter fog toward a village where nobody knew his name and started again. Agnes sat beside him and listened. She did not cry. She did not interrupt. She asked 2 questions and accepted the answers without anger. When he finished, they sat together in silence for a while, the way they had always sat together, her with her hands wrapped around warmth, him with his eyes on the fire, both of them comfortable in quiet. The coals in the forge glowed orange and deep red, the same color they had always been. "Does it change things?" Tomasz asked finally. His voice was low, a little afraid. Agnes looked at the fire for a moment. "You're still my father," she said. He nodded, once, and looked back at the coals. They sat there until the cold made it necessary to go inside. Above the village, Castle Krenberg stood on its hill with its banners and its torches and its great hall full of people who would spend the rest of the evening speaking quietly about what they had witnessed. Some of them would remember it for the rest of their lives. Some would tell the story to their children. A few would tell it wrong, adding details, adjusting the ending, making it neater than it was. But the ones who had been in the kitchen, the ones who had been in the stable, the ones who had watched her carry a burning cauldron without dropping it and walk away without a word, they would tell it right, because they had seen what she was made of long before anyone told them what she was called. Coal does not become gold by pretending. Gold does not stop being gold because it was covered in coal. If this story stayed with you, subscribe now and turn on notifications. Every week we bring you stories of quiet strength, dignity, and justice that arrives exactly when it should. Tell us in the comments, did Agnes make the right choice showing mercy to Lady Hedwiga? And where are you watching from tonight? We read every single one.